Thank you, Leland, for the very kind introduction, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm going to be talking today about co-authored work with Michael LaCour, who's a graduate student at UCLA. He's a very enterprising, energetic, productive student who has done not only these experiments, but as well on its way to doing other experiments like them. And I think that what I want to do today is convince you of the special power of the combination of field experimentation and panel survey work. So that when you put the two together, so that you have relatively unobtrusive measurement of attitudes in conjunction with field experimental interventions, you have a special kind of methodological recipe for extracting, I think, quite interesting and insightful conclusions out of the prejudice reduction literature, the persuasion literature. So I'm excited to present this research. I haven't presented it before. The paper is not 100% done, and I look forward to your feedback in order to get the paper the last few percent there before we send it off for review. So your feedback is much appreciated. The basic setup of the paper is what we call the long-standing skepticism of the ability to bring about enduring change in social attitudes. So, if you look at the works of people like David Sears and others, many of the take-home conclusions are racial and social attitudes are very slow-moving variables. They change gradually over time, if at all. Many of the works, for example, on attitudes with respect to gay men and lesbians suggest that attitudes move very, very slowly, if at all, in the course of multi-wave panel studies, even when the panel studies span a fairly substantial period of time. And from that literature, you might draw the conclusion that these attitudes are extraordinarily resilient, extraordinarily difficult to change. And I think one of the interesting things about this project is, and one of the canvassers who actually did the campaign that I'll be describing mentioned this to me, we say that these attitudes are stable and resistant to change, but how often have we tried to change them? I mean, very often we steer clear of the most controversial social issues precisely because controversy is likely to be aversive. You're likely to get into an argument, a dispute, and we tend to steer clear of those kinds of issues because we don't want to foment discord. But one of the questions is, what would happen if we actually tried to change attitudes? And I think you're going to see some, fairly eye-popping findings on that score. I think the other thing is to say is, there's skepticism that even if you could affect change in these attitudes, even if you could change minds, when people go back to their home environments, these attitudes will reassert themselves as people, basically rejoin their social groups and the kinds of social attitudes that those groups find normative. So the argument is you might be able to prime someone in the context of a survey experiment to think this or that, but 5 minutes later or 5 days later, that effect is gone. And this is the general critique of survey priming experiments, that you can produce short-term change, but you can't produce anything like enduring attitude change, where attitudes are typically defined as long-standing predispositions to respond to a class of stimulus objects. So you might be able to change an opinion or a momentary attitude, but not an attitude in the traditional sense. Sorry, it's the wrong one. I'm advancing the wrong computer. It's the one for the at-home audience. So Elizabeth Levy-Palak at Princeton and I, a former student of mine from Yale, have collaborated on a number of projects, and she's gone on to do some amazing projects of her own. And much of the work that we have done in common and our common interest is in the field of what might be called prejudice reduction. So it's really quite different from the typical literature in political science. If you think about the massive literatures that have grown out of the debates over symbolic racism, aversive racism, the implicit attitude expressions of prejudice. Almost all of these literatures are about the meaning and measurement of prejudice, not so much about what to do about it. It's true that many of the debates between Sears and Bobo, or Sears and Tetlock, or Sears and Snyderman are about the foundations of prejudice, and therefore about what kinds of things they might be linked to. But it's still unclear what kind of intervention you would actually devise in order to reduce, say, symbolic racism, which is typically defined as a blend of anti-black affect and conservative values like individualism. So the idea is you resent blacks because you see them as violating norms of individualism. Why can't they be more self-reliant, is the argument. So you're opposed to programs that help them because you don't think that they should be helped. In part, it's because you don't like them, and in part, it's because you have this kind of individualistic mindset. But then, what is the remedy for that sort of thing? If you wanted to reduce anti-black affect, how would you do it? Or if you wanted to reduce commitment to norms of individualism and self-reliance, how would you do that? And I think that this literature is almost entirely silent on that question. And as a result, for that reason, it tends to be very, very cynical, very, very pessimistic about the prospect of change, which feeds into the previous slide, namely that change is unlikely. That's the explanation for change. These are long-standing attitudes. They're resistant to change, and they don't change. So that's sort of the setup. Now, there are, however, ideas out. They're in political science, but they're in some sense outside the discussion in the literature that debates this issue in political behavior. There are ideas about what kinds of strategies might be used for prejudice reduction. And one of them dates back to Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, where he argued that the way to reduce prejudice, remember this in the 1940s, the way to reduce prejudice is to confront Americans, white Americans, is really what he was talking about, with the contradiction between their value commitment to equal treatment, individualism, equal rights on the one hand, and their visceral disdain for racial minorities and their belief in racial hierarchy on the other. So his idea was a kind of idea that later became known as value confrontation after Milton Rokeach's work on this topic, whereby you say to people whose attitudes you want to change, you believe X, okay, but if you believe X, it implies that you cannot believe Y. The two things cannot sit together. So you can't both say you're committed to individualism and deny, basically deny this other value. You can't say you're both committed to equal treatment and deny this other value. So the idea of value confrontation is putting these two things at odds with one another and causing attitude change to occur, in part because people strive to be consistent. They find inconsistency embarrassing and uncomfortable. That literature, however, is in some sense overshadowed by a much larger literature that you don't really see very much talked about in political science. You see a little bit on contact. Very often the literature on contact is actually more about threat and the activation of outgroup hostility than it is prejudice reduction. But outside political science, the contact hypothesis is really about prejudice reduction. And what's the argument there? Dating back to Gordon Allport's 1954 book? There it is, 54, yeah. There's this theory that basically says if you encounter a person of an outgroup who dispels your negative stereotypes about that group, you will rethink not only your stereotypes, but also your outgroup hostility, okay? And that argument has gone through a great many gyrations and modifications, so that now if you say, what is current in the world of contact theory, you would say, oh, contact hypothesis now has all these subpoints, all these corollaries, and say, well, the contact has to be of a very special type. It has to be equal status contact. It has to be contact perhaps in pursuit of a superordinate goal. So this is the argument about why interracial contact in the American military is thought to reduce prejudice, because we're all part of the same Army team and we're pulling for the same things. So the argument there is it's not just contact per se, but special forms of contact. And as a result of all of these kind of corollaries to the main hypothesis, when people think about the contact hypothesis, they think, well, it just doesn't happen on this planet. You just don't tend to see this kind of special circumstance ever occur at least in numbers that would actually produce substantial prejudice reduction. Okay, so what about GLBT, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, other people and prejudice toward them? I'll show you some overtime trends in just a minute, but suffice to say that if you don't have to go very far back in history to find open hostility toward this group. And the interesting thing from the standpoint of social science, quite apart from social policy, is that this is one of the groups, one of the very last groups, for which it is still not counternormative to express open hostility. Open hostility. I remember actually doing a survey in the 1990s where we asked questions about gay men and lesbians and homosexuality and that sort of thing. And we had the interviewers write down the comments that people were making quite apart from the answer, the closed-ended responses. So, and people would spontaneously volunteer that, oh, gay people, I think they should be thrown to the sharks. I think they should be run over in the road. I think they should be killed. And you think, whoa, we're missing this opportunity in some sense to study attitudes toward this group, in part because this is a lot like the open expression of racism, say in the surveys in the 1940s and 50s. So it's an interesting social science opportunity, but it's also an extremely interesting phenomenon for two other reasons. One is the very rapid pace of change in policy attitudes with respect to this domain, which I'll mention in just a minute in more detail, but also the political strategies that have surrounded the vilification of gay men and lesbians in politics. So in 2004 especially, you started to see the deliberate placement of Defense of Marriage Acts on ballot propositions precisely because these would win by a very large margin. Often this was in a solidly red state, but it was an opportunity to draw rabid conservatives to the polls, and so the argument was this was a strategy designed to bring out the conservative base. And in some cases, even after passing one of these laws, there would be another one on the ballot to word it even more strongly, precisely because it was just like a golden oldie. You could play it again and again, and it would keep delivering voters and votes. It was also a way not only to deliver votes, but also to deliver activists who would go canvassing precisely because they were so fired up about this issue on the conservative side. Now, the interesting thing about attitudes toward, for example, same-sex marriage is, how you have reversals not only at the level of, public opinion, but you also have reversals at the level all the way up to Obama himself. Right? I mean, he dramatically reversed his opinion on this issue, and the Supreme Court, although not necessarily responding decisively on this issue, handed down two landmark judgments last summer on this question, basically overturning California's Defense of Marriage Act law. So there's been a lot of change, and it's a very active and perhaps understudied but very interesting area. In terms of the change in public opinion, it's a little bit tricky to chart because survey questions, as we know, are delicate things, especially when wording changes, and the way in which pollsters and survey takers have worded these questions has changed dramatically, because in the old days you would refer to gay men as homosexuals, or maybe gay men and lesbians as homosexuals, but but not gay men and lesbians. And so as a result, when the questions start to change in 2005 on, you have to wonder how comparable they are to the old days. But just to give you a kind of crude shorthand sense of what the old days used to look like, when you ask, do you think that marriage between, at least in the old days, homosexuals should be legal, then in those days, at least in 96, which isn't that long ago, 68% opposed and 27% supportive, whereas in 2005, when they started to switch over the wording, well, it was still 59% opposed and 37% supportive. As you move into the Obama administration, you still see that it's 56-40. And remember that California passed its ban on same-sex marriage in the 2008 election, the very same election where they gave an overwhelming victory to Obama. So it's really quite an interesting sort of paradox that the two things should move in opposite ideological directions. And indeed, you see this 57, 56, 53, and I guess we're sort of cut off on that slide for some reason. What does it actually come down to? Anyway, they cross. Because this one ends up in the 40s, and this one ends up in the 50s. So now you have a not a solid majority, but you have a majority in favor of same-sex marriage, at least using the contemporary wording. And that's, compared to the usually glacial pace at which these social policies typically change, this is very rapid movement. This is just in the last 3 years. And although you could argue that sampling variability, I think that this has been shown again and again and again in fairly substantial polls, that the public is now much more closely divided and has a slight plurality in favor. Okay, so the outline for this talk, just moving very quickly as you can tell, but please feel free to interrupt at any time. I want to talk about the experiment that we're going to describe, and in particular I want to give some time to explaining the placebo-controlled design, because we're going to, as you'll see in a moment, talk about a campaign, an actual campaign called Vote for Equality. They're going to knock on people's doors, and they're going to deliver, randomly, one of two messages. A message about the importance of gay equality, that's the treatment, or a message about the importance of recycling, that's the placebo. Okay, and then there's going to be a survey that is going to measure attitude change, and there's going to be an omnibus survey. Very, very little of this survey is going to deal with, gay and lesbian people or policies about them. So you really would not know that there's a connection between the canvassers and the outcomes if you're taking this survey. So that's the basic setup. We're going to assess what we're going to call the direct effects, or the immediate effects. We're going to call the first-hand effects. These are the effects of the treatment on the people who answer the door. So you answer the door, there's either going to be a placebo message or the same-sex marriage message. Okay? And the direct effects are the effects on your attitudes as a door answerer. Then we're going to talk about the spillover effects. I'll come back to the durability in just a minute. We're going to talk about the spillover effects on the other members of the household who are also answering these panel surveys. Okay, so the idea of the panel survey is you enroll lots of people from the household, and somebody shows up to answer the door. You're not only interested in their attitude change, but also the attitude change among others with whom the canvassers did not speak. We're interested in the durability of those effects because of this long-standing concern that you could affect attitude change and have it evaporate within a day or two on the grounds that people return to their usual social environments and their prejudices are reasserted. And then, because the opinions, well, I just want to back up. This overtime stability is going to be made somewhat more interesting, or at least the study of overtime stability is more interesting in this case because the landmark Supreme Court judgment is going to happen a few weeks into the study. Okay, so there's going to be canvassing, no more canvassing. Now we're just tracking the durability of attitude change, and then boom, all of a sudden we have the two landmark court decisions handed down to great fanfare. And you'll see an immediate attitude shift. And I won't spoil well, I will spoil it. You're going to see that the treatment effect actually expands after the court decisions. So as if to say that the treatment is not only affecting what you think, but also how you interpret news about the subject. Please.
Was this planned, the timing?
Yes. Yes. Well, we didn't tell the court when to decide it, but we knew that the decision was coming, so that's why we tried to get into the field. And then, because the results are so eye-popping, we're going to do the same thing. Obviously, we can't get the court to decide anything again, but now we're back to basically a baseline. Now you'll see that after the court makes its decision, there's a shift in opinion and it quickly subsides. And those of you who have read the University of Chicago guy, Hollow Hope, Gerald Rosenberg's book on attitude change in the wake of court decisions, know that there's a kind of rather unhappy literature that suggests that when the court made the Brown decision and other decisions, there was not an enduring shift in public opinion. And you'll see some evidence for that here too. So that's kind of an interesting corrective to the idea that people just follow these elite signals. So then, the results are very eye-popping. We're going to do the whole thing again, and then we're going to talk about conclusions because, of course, this is one canvassing operation with one issue, and the question is, what would happen if we were to change some of the active ingredients? Okay. So the background for this particular study is really quite interesting. As I mentioned, in 2008, California voters passed Prop 8, which was their Defense of Marriage Act, effectively. And after that defeat, the Vote for Equality group, this kind of arm of LGBT organization in Los Angeles, decided, look, we're outgunned in terms of advertising money. We need to talk to people who voted against us in Prop 8. So they started to canvass the precincts that they lost after Prop 8's passage. And roughly 12,000 conversations with voters later, they developed what they believed was an effective script in terms of changing people's minds. So they worked on a lot of different things, and just by trial and error, they came to a particular intervention. I'll describe it in a minute, but what's fun about it is that it is a little bit like a melange of what you would infer from an intro psychology class. So if you're doing an intro to social psychology class, you would say, okay, so now let's take like a mashup of all the little things we've learned in the course of a semester that might change opinions. And they weren't trying to do that. They weren't drawing on any particular theory. They just more or less did it inductively. And you'll see that this is quite a powerful way to develop a script. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you do 12,000 trial and errors for anything, but at one point I had lunch with the director, really incredibly energetic and enterprising, smart guy. He said, Don, I think we have a recipe. His name is Dave Fleischer. I think we have a recipe for finally changing attitudes on this question. And I said, well, Dave, what's your evidence for this? And he said, well, we ask people what they think. They're much more likely to be supportive at the end than they were at the beginning. I said, well, Dave, that's not really very good evidence, because there's a whole lot of social desirability associated with asking people the same thing twice after giving a pep talk in the middle. Let's do this in an unobtrusive way and see whether there's something there. And I don't have a dog in this fight. I mean, if it worked, it worked. If it didn't, okay, we'll do something else. But I was quite interested to do an evaluation precisely because of this. Michael LaCour, was extremely interested in doing this, and he really took the lead in terms of orchestrating the study and doing it to a T. Monitoring the canvassers, making sure that people were following instructions. And so to the extent that this experiment has some amazingly nice features in terms of its implementation, Michael deserves all the credit. But Dave deserves some of the credit for the ideas. So the design, the overview, first you lay down an internet panel. So you basically create and recruit a group of people who are going to be your respondents. And the idea is you're going to try to get them to not only join the panel, but also you're effectively doing a snowball sample where you're trying to get them to bring into the panel their friends and family. So you give them a participation bonus in cash for being part of the panel. And once you've laid down the panel, then you're ready to randomly assign people to treatment and control. And in this particular design, as I'll say in just a minute, in study 1, you have a control group that's not going to get any canvassing. You have a placebo group that's going to get canvassing on the issue of recycling. You have a treatment group that's going to get canvassing on the issue of same-sex marriage. And then, as I'll explain in just a minute, you're going to have 2 different kinds of messengers. You're going to have gay messengers and straight messengers. And you'll see in the script that in the same-sex marriage message, not in the recycling message, the messengers are going to reveal to the respondent their sexual orientation. Okay, so there's a script, a scripted conversation in both cases, and the scripts are going to differ. And the idea is you're going to go in there and canvass on basically one day, do as many houses as you can, and then you're just going to let the chips fall where they may. And then in subsequent waves of the survey, you're going to see whether the treatment group and the placebo group differ, and whether that difference persists. Okay, so that's the setup. And the nice thing is that it's a relatively unobtrusive design. Now, the placebo control is overcoming a fundamental methodological hurdle here, which is the failure to treat. You knock on people's doors, they don't necessarily answer. And so the idea of a placebo control is you're effectively conditioning on the people who answer the door. So given that a person answers the door, they're going to get one script or the other. Now we can do this in a more classical Angrist, Imbens, and Rubin framework, where we compare the purely untreated to the treated, and we do that. But the answers are basically the same, and this is a much more powerful strategy. So they're going to deliver one message to the other. It's not the first time this has been done. David Nickerson did this in his 2008 APSR article. It's a former student of mine who's now teaching at Notre Dame. He did the same thing, but his study was designed to tap the spillover effects of get out the vote appeals. Again, vis-a-vis recycling. To detect spillovers, we're going to look at the attitudes as expressed by the other people in the household, the people who did not come to the door. So the door is opened, and now we have the treatment person versus the placebo person, and because of that design, we also have the housemates of the treatment person and the housemates of the placebo person. And by comparing them, we get an assessment of the spillover effects. And the question is, do you see any evidence that the treatment effects spilled over? We don't know why, but do we see evidence? Okay, so as I mentioned just now, the experiment was launched in anticipation of the court's ruling, and then we instructed the Supreme Court to hand out its ruling, which it did. It was very nice of it, and it's nice of it also to have a nice 5-4 decision. They're striking down state sector. It's kind of interesting, good and ambiguous. And then we're going to look at attitude change instantaneously because we're going to measure attitudes at various points in time. Okay, so what about the script? As I mentioned, the Vote for Equality script is developed by trial and error. What are its key ingredients? I believe that in your handout, the back page, pretty small type, sorry about that. Back page has the 2 script ingredients, same-sex marriage script and the recycling script. And I think that the idea of the script is sort of the following thing. You're going to start off with what is effectively like an interview. You're going to talk to people about what they think about same-sex marriage, but you're also going to then invite them to talk about their own relationship. So tell me about your, marriage, or a marriage of somebody you know, and you're going to listen carefully. I think this is the key idea. That the average conversation in the canvassing script is 20 minutes long. Okay, it's a long, unhurried conversation. Tell me about your marriage. It's very nice, interesting. You've been married to so and so, and for how long, and so you're kind of drawing the respondent into a full description of the advantages, effectively, of this privilege of marriage. And then you're going to say, if you're a gay canvasser, well, I'm gay, and I'm unable to have that privilege of marriage. I'm not allowed to get married. I want to get married, but I'm not allowed to. Or if you're straight, you say, I have a gay friend or brother or whatever. They want to get married, and I want this law to apply to them. And so there's no deception here. Okay, so nobody's saying that they're gay when they're straight or straight when they're gay. So there is inevitably a bit of a correlation between the message and the messenger. So we should just sort of recognize that right at the outset. But that said, the point is, at that point, we enter the kind of Myrdal, Rokeach world of value confrontation. So you could say it's also the case that you're engaged in contact, right? Because the people who are now in contact with the gay canvasser know it's a gay canvasser. But you're also now confronting them with the contradiction between their own enjoyment of marriage as an institution and the fact that it's not available to me or to my friend. And so that's the kicker. Okay, so this is one of the key features of the experimental intervention is which sexual orientation people reveal. And then I think that the important thing about there are 2 things, actually. One I didn't have room to list here, is after you continue the conversation about gay equality and same-sex marriage, you then say, so I noticed that you've moved a little bit on this issue. Is that right? Explain how you've changed since we've been talking. And then that person re-explains, well, I started off thinking that gays were icky, but now I think they're not so much, or maybe they're okay. So even though I'm still opposed to same-sex marriage, I'm not as opposed, okay? Okay. Okay. And so the idea is that turns out to be quite an interesting tactic, by the way, for reinforcing attitude change. To have people rehearse their own points of view. So it's it's again, Psych 101 type stuff. And then the last thing that happens is there's an amicable ending of the conversation without a request for money. It's not a request for a petition signature. It's like nothing. Thanks for your time. It was really, I really enjoyed this conversation, and hope we have a chance to talk again sometime. And then we leave. So that's not which I find to be. I mean, again, I have not tested this experimentally, but damn interesting to test. I think that the irony of a lot of door-to-door canvassing for tawdry fundraising purposes is to basically sour the image of the groups that are canvassing. Basically all these folks who send the well-dressed college student to the door, they're basically doing a lot of damage to their own image in the eyes of the people they're canvassing, even when they're relatively supportive, because at the end of the day, it's just a cheesy fundraising field. This is not. Okay? So I think one of the things here is it's not confrontational. So these canvassers are carefully trained, carefully supervised. You're not supposed to argue with people. If they say, I think that God has damned to hellfire gay men and lesbians, they have no right to do anything that normal people do, you're not supposed to talk back. You're saying, just listen. And the whole point is to kind of listen and let them kind of talk it through, but eventually to confront this kind of contradiction between who's eligible for certain rights. Very Myrdalian. Okay, so that's the treatment. We're going on and on. So before we get to the design, we have to kind of review core assumptions apropos of the second talk that I gave, the talk at 11 o'clock. So we talked for an hour and a half about core assumptions, and there they are, kind of laid bare. So we've got random assignments, and so as a result, there's nothing about the kind of people who get the treatment that makes them different from the people who get the control in any systematic way. It's just sampling variability. Attrition, now it would be a problem if people were to drop out of the study differentially between treatment and placebo, but that does not occur. And indeed, the measurement of outcomes is so subtle here that there's not only very little attrition, there's very little differential attrition, and there's no evidence that attrition is related to covariance in any differential way across groups. So that's very solid. In terms of contact, the study is vulnerable to one problem, one big problem, which is, suppose these canvassers, who after all are working for Vote for Equality, they don't really care about recycling. Suppose they tried extra hard to canvass the people with the same-sex marriage message, but they were kind of lackadaisical about what they did for recycling. Then you would see different contact rates in the two groups and different predictors of contact in the two groups. So it was very, very important to supervise these folks very carefully to make sure they were using exactly the same procedures in both groups. And again, Michael gets all the credit for making this happen. So that is true. There's almost no difference between the two groups in terms of who shows up to the door. And then we finally have our sort of placebo assumption, which says, look, we don't think that the placebo is affecting same-sex marriage attitudes. And it is an interesting fact that the gay canvassers in the placebo group had no apparent effect on attitudes toward gay men and lesbians. Remember, they don't reveal their sexual orientation, and they're having what is effectively a 3-minute conversation, not a 20-minute conversation about recycling. So it's a totally different kind of thing, but mere contact without any context has no effect, which I think is pretty interesting. It's theoretically interesting. It's also interesting, by the way, as I'll point out in a minute, that the placebo treatment had a fairly modest effect on placebo, on the recycling attitudes, because Los Angeles County had a recycling ballot proposition. And so there's a direct connection between the recycling message and this ballot proposition, but support for the ballot proposition moved in a fairly trivial way in the placebo group, which is, again, another indication that there's something more elemental in terms of the psychological dynamics that produce change than what was present in, say, the placebo group. Okay, so let's go to the tables. Whoops, these things look terrible. Huh. All right, well, it doesn't matter. We'll go to the paper. I wonder if this one looks okay.
That's weird.
Yeah, that's okay, maybe. Whatever. It's the iron law of PowerPoint. Doesn't matter. Okay, so let's go to some of the tables. First of all, if you grab table 3, you see the design. And this breaks down the people by their assigned status and whether they were contacted directly in a secondhand way or not at all. So what's important here is, these are not massive numbers. This study actually has quite a lot of power, but the power derives from the fact that you have a really big treatment effect, number one, and remember, you have the baseline surveys completed by each of the subjects. So they've already told you what they think about each of the dependent variables in the days before the Canvas. And now they've been randomly assigned, and now you're going to basically study attitude change, which gives you a whole lot more power, because past attitudes are so predictive of current attitudes that the R-squared is very, very high. There's very little residual variability. But you can see that we have more people who get the second-hand contact because they're the housemates of the people who are contacted directly. And then, of course, lots of people who get no contact at all. Okay, so then at the bottom of page 39, table 4, just lists the people who are responding to the survey in each of the waves, and you can see that there's a bit of a drop-off in terms of who responds to the survey after the first wave, but then things are relatively stable after that. So there's panel attrition, but it's not massive, fairly minimal, and it's not related to treatment assignment. Okay, so then let's see. I'll talk from the picture, and you can see the numbers in the table, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the table. Let's see, the picture's kind of cut off. So, oh well. Maybe what we do is change the. That one looks great. The one they're seeing at home was really good. But this one, not so much. Maybe you can change the display focus. That's okay. Why don't we talk about the table? It's the iron law of PowerPoint. It's like I never worry about anything but the PowerPoint. So why don't we talk a little bit about table 5? So if you flip to table 5 and you look at panel A, so the very first panel here, okay? Same-sex marriage is measured with a scale that goes from 1 to 5. Right? And what you see is if you track the pre-wave, wave 1, you find that support for same-sex marriage is, roughly 3.2, 3.1, 3.1, 3.2. So it's in a fairly narrow band for all 4 of the groups, as you'd expect, because they're randomly assigned. So what happens between waves 1 and 2? Well, you can see that for those who are canvassed by the gay canvasser, they go from 3.17 to 3.59. Those who are canvassed by the straight canvasser go from 3.05 to 3.51. So they move basically a half a scale point. It's not an enormous move. It's not a kind of life-altering move, but it's a fairly substantial move. You'll see that the recycling canvassers, whether they're gay or straight, have no effect whatsoever. Okay, so the bottom line to columns 1 and 2 for table 5 in panel A is the canvassers delivering the same-sex marriage script, regardless of whether they were gay or straight, had a fairly profound effect on same-sex marriage levels. Now you might say, well, I don't really get how big an effect that is. That effect, if you look at the 2012 cooperative election study dataset, using the exact same question on same-sex marriage, you'll see that gap is as big as going from Oklahoma and Nebraska on the one hand in the control group to Connecticut and Massachusetts in the treatment group. Okay, so that it's like taking a Midwesterner and turning them into a Northeasterner. That's how big that gap is in terms of state-to-state variability. And you can see even more profound, or maybe in a more interpretable metric, the effects on the gay and lesbian feeling thermometer. So remember, these feeling thermometers say, I'm going to give you a scale from 0 to 100. I want you to indicate how warmly you feel toward this group. I'm going to name a bunch of groups. And incidentally, there's no effect on any other group besides gay men and lesbians. So the average ranking in the 4 groups, you have 61.5, 57.7, 60.6, 59.8. They're roughly in the neighborhood of 60 degrees. After canvassing, the gay canvassers are up at, they've moved their respondents to 72.1. The straight canvassers have moved their respondents a little bit too, to 63.4. The placebos don't move at all. Oops, this moved on. It's not it's fine. It's fine. So basically, my point here is not only did the conversation about same-sex marriage move attitudes toward this policy issue, it also changed feelings about gay men and lesbians, especially, and this is really the important part, especially among those who spoke with the gay canvasser. So that suggests that there was something really important about the contact that was going on. It's not the cleanest test in the world because, again, there's a correlation between the messenger and the message based on what they reveal. That said, to move a feeling thermometer 12 or 13 points is quite substantial. Again, it's the difference between going from the Midwest to Rhode Island and Connecticut. And it's a huge shift, huge shift. Okay, so that's that effect. Let's then go to the next one. Whoops. Well, it's all right. Don't worry. We'll just we've got all the tables. I like tables better anyway. Let's go to table 6. Secondhand persuasion effects. So now we're no longer talking about the people who answered the door. What we're talking about here are the people who are in the same households as the people who answered the door. And this is the critical one. Okay? So if you're looking at this table, you again want to start with panel A. You find that in wave number 1, all these people are somewhere in the order of 3.0, 2.9, 3.2, something like that. They all start about equivalent. And then in the wake of talking to the gay canvasser, and only the gay canvasser, and this is really the critical finding, the housemates move. So, if Ann and I live together, and Ann answers the door, and it's the straight canvasser, I don't move. Okay, but if it's the gay canvasser, I move. Okay, and not only do I move, but I stay moved in ways that we'll come back to in just a minute. So my point here is that, and again, you have to kind of put table 5 and table 6 together in your minds. The direct effect was the same for the straight and the gay canvassers on attitudes towards same-sex marriage. A profound and immediate effect on that issue. But only the gay canvassers produced spillover effects on others in the household, suggesting that there may have been something about the contact with the gay canvasser that caused people to talk about it amongst their households, household members, I should say. Okay, so it's really quite interesting because, as we're going to come to at the end, we're trying to understand this massive and abrupt shift in public opinion, and one way to explain it is the proportion of people who openly call themselves gay has doubled or tripled in the past decade and a half. And so the point of the study, although it's not directly about that, is to lend some credence to the idea that that effect itself represents a massive contact effect. Okay, so that's a find. Notice also that when you look at the gay feeling thermometer, you see some evidence, although it's a little bit murkier, that people are moving. There's a secondhand movement effect. And you see that in the bottom panel most clearly. So panel D tracks the same people over time. And you see that there's about a 2-point shift in gay feeling thermometer scores for people who were in the same household as a contacted person. Let's go back to table 5 for just a second and consider the overtime stability of these effects. And here, I guess I would focus our attention primarily on the same-sex marriage question. So in the same-sex marriage question, you say, look at say panel B. So these give effectively the effect sizes. So there's about a 0.5 point movement from wave 1, which is the pre-survey, to wave 2, which is the post-survey. And you ask, what endures? Well, if you look at the line of numbers, you see it goes from 0.46 to 0.49 to 0.48. So in the first four waves, you see a movement from the baseline up to an immediate shift, and that shift remains flat for the next several weeks until the Supreme Court decision. So that suggests that if you got the gay canvasser, you really did move dramatically. If, on the other hand, you got the straight canvasser, the effect dissipated. So you moved a few days later, 0.5 scale points, but then 0.14, 0.03. So there was nothing left within 2 weeks of contacting the straight cancer. Yes.
What were the lengths of time between each of those?
You know, that was what was on the graph. So let's do it here. So it's May 29th and 30th is the pre-survey. The canvassing occurs, I think it says it on the previous one. I think it's June 1st, something like that. June 2nd, maybe. And then the 3rd to 5th, they do a post-survey. So this is a lot like a lab study at this point. You know, we're talking about very, very short-term measurement, I should say. And then there's another study 10 days later, another 10 days after that, and then we're going to keep going to the right. Maybe surveys about 5 days after the Supreme Court decision, and then a couple weeks later. So altogether, there's about a 4 to 6 week gap between the beginning and the end. Not, you know, super long term, but we didn't want to lose people. What?
What kind of lunatic would answer 5 surveys in 10 days?
Yeah, the lunatic is being paid quite a lot of bonus money for sticking with it. And these surveys they're rotating the content of the questionnaire. But I agree. I think if I were to do this again, and we did do it again, you'll see the replication. But I think if I were to do this again, I would. In the internet survey biz, you're told you better keep your surveys going because otherwise people will drop out. On the other hand, as you say, you don't want to overdo it. What's interesting about it, though, is if you look at table 5, I mean, people are really moving around a lot, and they're moving around in a way that is not easily explained by social desirability. I mean, they're very stable in terms of their averages, but in terms of the treatment effect, the straight canvassers produce an effect, and it immediately dissipates. And what's interesting, again, is that the straight and gay canvassers produce an effect immediately, and only the gay canvassers produce a spillover effect. Okay, so let's also look at again at table 5 to look at the court effect. So if you look at the court effect, that's in panel B. So again, 0.83 represents how different on average your views were vis-a-vis your baseline wave before the canvassing occurred. So now it's June 28th to 30th versus May 29th to 30th. It's a month later. How different are your views? Well, the Supreme Court has just announced its views, and you've moved from 0.48 in wave 4 to 0.83 in wave 5. So you've shot up. You've been conversing with a gay canvasser. What about a straight canvasser? You went from 0.03 to 0.24. So you continue to expand your treatment effect, but not as much as the person who talked to the gay canvasser. And the placebo folks, they move a little bit, but by wave 6, which is only a few weeks later, that effect is gone. So it's kind of interesting is that the Supreme Court effect is kind of negligible overall. If you didn't have a panel survey in the field, you wouldn't detect it. And it's kind of interesting because when you say, what is the effect of Obama's announcement that he favored same-sex marriage? If you looked at the surveys that were in the field, almost too small to detect, very small. So it's one of those things where if you don't have the film in the camera, you'll miss this relatively subtle thing, which is very different from the usual arguments you hear about elite opinion leadership and things like that. But what you do see is that the treatment effect widens for our experimental groups. So in the wake of canvassing, you actually get an expanded treatment effect. Or another way to say it is, this conversation changed the way in which people heard the news later on, which I think is quite an interesting finding. As far as I know, the first finding to sort of talk about the interaction between something that happens, in the context of an experiment and something that happens in the world. But what about the secondhand treatment effects? Well, again, panel B points out that, again, everybody boosts up in the wake of the court decision, but only the people who had the secondhand exposure to the gay canvasser persist in terms of their attitude change, which I interpret to be the effect of intra-household discussion about gay people. Because it not only affects them, it affects the attitudes there, it also affects the attitudes regarding feeling thermometers. Okay, so you might say, there is no way that could be true, there must be something wrong, can't see this kind of attitude change, so we did a replication. So in study 2, which is in table 9, there's the design. we sort of do an abbreviated version of it. Since the real magic is happening with gay canvassers, we just send out gay canvassers. And we did not use a placebo group because we wanted to make this very, very straightforward. So now this is just, direct, secondhand versus nothing. And we're going to use the usual methods for assessing treatment effects here. The bottom line is everything is exactly the same as it was in study 1. The effects on same-sex marriage are the same, if not a little bit larger. The effects on feeling thermometers are the same, if not a little bit larger. The spillover effects are the same, if not a bit larger. And it's really quite an interesting commentary on the fact that this is kind of an enduring effect. Because if you look at table 10, which is the last table, you see a very, very similar pattern. You see that the direct change score is in the neighborhood of 0.7, and it persists into several weeks later. So, I mean, I'm to blame in some sense for making them do this again, because I thought, well, I'm not sure that I can believe it, given that these effects are so profound. I want to see the magic again, because I would think the natural next step is to go to some other location. But this is still in the same general location of Southern California. By the way, I suspected that the second study was done by the really crack crew of Vote for Equality. That part of the reason everything looked great was because these were the really great canvassers. And I was told by the director, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, if you saw the crew of people that we fielded, I mean, they were very effective, but it wasn't as though, they had some special magical touch. And I should also point out, although, again, I need to gather more data on this, that you should not assume that the canvassers here were what might be described as heteronormative. Some were, some weren't. It really varied, and what's kind of interesting about it is, when you look at the treatment effects, it looks, pretty solid, pretty darn solid. It doesn't look like there's something special about these canvassers. Seems like anybody can do it. And I think one of the really quite interesting things about this, and it's a tribute actually to Dave Fleischer's incredible optimism and courage, actually, is the idea that you can take almost anybody and make them into an effective spokesperson for this cause by simply, following this kind of scripted conversation using these kind of basic psychological principles. So let's kind of wrap up. Okay. All right. So first of all, the persuasion effects are huge, and they're enduring. I mean, they didn't disappear after a few weeks. If we're going to go back into the field, probably 9 to 12 months after the original survey and re-interview these people, there will be substantial attrition because we haven't talked to them in a while. But I don't think there will be differential attrition, and I'll be curious to see how much of this endures. But I think it's really quite interesting to think that the particular pattern that we've got is suggestive of the contact hypothesis. That that the effect was instantaneous for both messengers, but only enduring for the gay messenger, and it only spilled over to other household members for the gay canvasser, which I think is quite interesting, and it's also consistent with so-called theories of extended contact. These theories are basically, I'm affected by the people whom I know secondhand. So you give me a vivid description of a person who I regard as an outgroup, and because you and I like each other, or family members, or friends, or whatever, I'm moved by your description. That's very consistent with what we find here. It's interesting that once the court hands down its decision, the treatment versus controlled distinction is amplified, suggesting that the legitimation of this position basically makes people think that they ought to continue this trajectory of attitude change that they're on. Or maybe they listen to the news in a different way. They say, I've rethought my view, and the court's rethought its view. And now, maybe the world is a different place, and we're all moving. I just have to reinforce, though, that when we talk about movement, we're talking about a half a scale point on average. So I don't want you to think that it's so large as to be, the kind of night and day thing that you would you would see with the naked eye with a single intervention. I mean, I think it's the kind of thing that you might see if you did it with, say, 10 or 20 people, but you're basically moving a whole lot of people from either strongly opposed to somewhat opposed, or you're moving them from somewhat favorable to strongly favorable, but you're not necessarily causing people to move, say, 2 or 3 scale points from strongly opposed to neutral or somewhat favorable. As I mentioned before, finally, the recycling messages are not effective, suggesting that a lot of what is called persuasion research in the context of campaign field experiments is not all that persuasive. The standard appeal, please do X, or we're here to talk about X, without any kind of extra psychological oomph, probably is not all that inspiring. And then as we look ahead, what I really want to do is to add and subtract ingredients. We talked a little bit last conversation about mediation and finding the active mechanisms here, and I was thinking it really would be fascinating to expand this study to add and subtract ingredients, and in particular add and subtract ingredients from the way in which the script on the back page operates. What if you were more confrontational? Right? That'd be quite an interesting thing. What if you didn't use value confrontation? Use some other tactic. What if you didn't start off with a survey? What if you simply said, here's what I think. You should think like me. That would be kind of interesting. And then, of course, changing the messengers, too, would be darn interesting. But I think that now that this study is about to be out there in the world, I think there will be people who want to apply this to other issues in other domains, maybe the same domain, but in other aspects of this domain. I mean, it's quite interesting to think, marriage is a very, very conservative institution. When you, as a gay person, are saying, I want to affirm this very conservative institution, you are sort of implicitly saying, we share these same underlying conservative values, so I'm not so different from you. And that's also a contact hypothesis type mechanism. But what if this is about some other subject? For example, it looks as though, although it remains to be seen, that a ballot measure may qualify in California about equal treatment for transgendered children in schools. Okay, well now that's a somewhat dicier thing. There's no conservative institution to which you're appealing, and so it's interesting to ask whether this kind of appeal would work. It's interesting to ask whether this appeal would work in other domains where this kind of equal treatment norm may or may not apply. So, for example, abortion rights is going to be on many ballot measures around the country, and certainly likely to be in a variety of places, perhaps including California. And so there are a lot of people canvassing on this issue, and the question is, can you adapt this kind of approach for abortion? For example, having the canvassers have some personal connection to the issue. Would that be especially effective? And would it work on the right as well as the left? I'm kind of guessing it's a little harder to do on the right, but not impossible. You can imagine an equal treatment type thing involving the right. I'm not quite sure how it would work exactly, but you could sort of imagine appealing to core values and say, you extend them here, why don't you extend them there? And then I think this last thing is just something I think about all the time, which is when you look at the massive shift in the proportion of people in public opinion polls who report being gay, okay? I mean, it's just huge. Or they report having friends or family members who are gay. Also, just a massive shift. I mean, it can't literally be the case that it's true, right? I mean, it can't literally be the case that they didn't have family members who were gay. It's just that either they were unaware of it or they wouldn't admit it, and we can't separate the two. But it's such a profound change. It's one of the most profound changes in the history of public opinion research, and it's just kind of interesting to think that it dovetails almost exactly with what this experiment would lead you to expect in terms of producing attitude change in this policy. So let me open it up for comments or questions. Sorry the graphs didn't work out, but it's okay. They're just eye candy. The real stuff is in the tables.
Professor, do you mind if I try and fix the graphs and show them?
Well, sure, but it's not. I think we're done now. So don't worry. Thank you, Hunter.
Comment?
Please.
Bruce, at what time did the gay
professor developed himself as a kid? Very early on, from the very beginning.
No, it was in the middle. It's you see on the scripts in Figure 1 on the left-hand column. Okay, when you see the bold that says share personal experiences, that's what they're telling them.
Did the straight person introduce himself as a straight person as such?
No, they just said they didn't say anything about their own sexual orientation. They just said, I have a brother, I have a friend, I have a whatever.
Didn't say explicitly.
Not about themselves.
Did the divorce react differently?
Did what?
The divorce subject.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. We should probably. I mean, it's a kind of interesting thing. Like, I had this negative experience with this, and I don't like gay people, so I want you to have it.
And finally, a comment for the more difficult question, also interpretation. One reaction is that yes, this is a big effect, but in real life, it's extremely rare that we have this kind of conversation where you sort of very polite, you've been trained to do things okay and so on, so that in real life, this almost never occurs.
Yes.
This is sort of unreal in many ways.
Yes. I think that's a really important point. I mean, I think this gets back to Dave Fleischer's point about, how do we know these attitudes are stable? Because it's so out of equilibrium to ever confront them. And that's why I really want to do this study on abortion, because abortion is widely regarded as absolutely rock solid. Abortion attitudes cannot be moved. But I can't even remember the last time I had a conversation about abortion with someone who's on the other side of the issue. And it'd be really quite interesting to just say, like, okay, so tell me your position. Like, how did you come to that position?
Do you think we could apply some approach to behavior, like for instance smoking? And try to apply a similar kind of design to try to change people, convince people to stop smoking?
Well, the thing about smoking that's different is that it's not. You could do it in a value confrontation way, but maybe. Well, I got my mom to quit smoking. Come to think of it, in a value confrontation way. Yeah. Anyway, the idea is the value confrontation is you want to project this kind of image to us, your kids, but what gives, Mom? I see a lot of. All right. So here's what I did. Literally. This was. She tried to quit many times when I was a kid. Never stuck. It's a cheap move on my part, but I knew it would work, and it did work. I was in high school, and I said, Mom, I gotta say, you're smoking. I just want to point this out, that a lot of the sluttiest girls in my school smoke. That was it. There was no. I haven't told that story ever. It's a little flushed, but that was it. Anyway, but that was not so much a value confrontation one as a self-conception one. But that's I think that when you think about why it is that there's a class stratification to smoking in the United States that isn't true for, say, parts of Europe. In part it's because of the self-conception that goes along with smoking. But at any rate, I think that in the world of politics, what's kind of interesting is when people say, I believe that abortion is morally wrong. I believe that it's murder. I think that anybody who does it should be tried for murder. That it should be totally illegal. I wonder whether you say, look, I think it's a tragedy. I think it's wrong too. But at the end of the day, there are people who are getting abortions, and the question is, do you want them to go from Louisiana to California to get abortions, or do you think, maybe they should just get them in Louisiana? And it's just kind of an interesting question. What would move them? Because if they have to go to California, then it means only wealthier people get these abortions. But maybe they take the view that if we can prevent one abortion, it's good. But I don't know. That's what's kind of interesting. I don't think anyone's ever tried to persuade people on this issue. You got a fourth one? That's it. Great. Yes.
find your presentation very interesting. I have, two questions. One is about the fact that since this is a panel survey and you have measurement before treatment, it would be possible to investigate whether the effect is more strong among those people who have a very bad attitude regarding homosexuals, or it is a strong effect on those people who are already soft or already positive.
Right, you'll see this in the paper. We study the so-called transition table of the baseline measurement to the first post-treatment measurement, and we track who moves. And obviously, if you're at the most strongly favorable position, you can't move. But if you're below that, you see almost like a uniform relative shift.
And the second question is about the organization of this experiment, because so this is a web panel survey, so you need to have people's address to go and reach them at their address to have an exchange with that. Was it complicated? I mean, you had an agreement with the survey firm, or how does it work? Because you need to deal with the homosexual group, the pro-gay marriage group, and who paid for that? Was it the pro-gay marriage group, or was it the research found?
No, this is all done with, well, the money for the canvassers is separate. That's a separate operation. The surveys is another separate operation, and basically the idea is to marry the two. To say, look, we've got this survey on the ground. We're not going to tell you who's in the treatment group and who's in the control group. Just go do your thing. You don't.
The survey firm kind of gave you the addresses.
No, because these people were sampled from the voter file. Remember, the United States has these voter files where everybody's address is already listed. So please join our internet panel. We already have their address. And again, you could do this the other way. You could say, I'm going to send my canvassers door to door with the voter file, to contact people who are registered voters, either in the treatment group or the control group. And then you could try to survey people afterward. It's just that it's a whole lot less statistically precise that way. And it achieves exactly the same thing. I mean, there's really no difference between doing one or the other. It's just that it's a lot more costly to do the latter one. But 99% of all the attitude research, persuasion research done in the field uses that method. It deploys some kind of persuasive treatment and then surveys people afterward. And you could do that here. The only advantage of doing it this way is that we have people's baseline surveys, and as a result, we have a whole lot more statistical power. Look.
Your survey technique measures the stimulus response. What's really interesting is the mechanism. And I'm wondering, when you describe how David Fleischer, my trial area, develops the mechanism, and have you tried for going back and looking at some of these profile interviews, or interviewing the people the canvassers who did those profile interviews, to find out how they experience different forms of contact? After all, this is a form of contact that has the effect, not just the contact per se. That's one question. The other question is, how do you get this past the ethics? If I tried to get funding and do this project at my university, I would be required to swear up and down that I was going to tell people what I was doing to them. And obviously, I don't think he did that.
Yeah, well, we certainly told them that they were part of a survey, but we did not tell them that there was a connection to the vote for equality part. Now, it's an interesting question. Is it deception? Not sure. It's not as though we told them that there wasn't a connection when there was. It's a kind of omission. We did not tell them. Now we could debrief them now, and then the question would be, are we making them worse off? Right? Well, you were canvassed as part of this. I don't think there's any ethical problem in canvassing these people, but I think that it's a kind of interesting question.
It's sort of a rhetorical question,
Yeah.
because when I interview people, I never tell
Yeah. I mean, with respect to the canvasser's point, I think it would be kind of interesting. I have been thinking about how to how to talk to the canvassers, because I really, in some ways, want to learn about each of the canvassers who participated in this study. Because one of the things that's kind of cool about the study is since every canvasser switched randomly back and forth between the treatment and placebo script, you actually get a treatment effect for each canvasser. And so I thought it would be quite interesting to ask, what was the canvasser level effect? I mean, obviously, straight people never represented themselves to be gay, or vice versa. So you basically have straight placebo versus straight treatment, and gay placebo versus gay treatment. But it'd be damn interesting to know it. There were some videos taken not of our experiment. These were not people in our experiment, but just videos taken of the canvassing operation, where they just had a crew to kind of, here's what it looks like to do this stuff. And those videos are really quite interesting. And I'd like to just separately, a totally different thing, not our subjects, get some more of those using this exact treatment, because it's a little like the movement in surgical experiments where you film the surgery so you have an exact record of what we mean by this treatment. Please.
Hi, it was a very nice presentation.
Thank you.
I would like to know if you could provide more information about the personal characteristics of those who are more likely to change their opinion. And also, if you have information about the gender of the canvasser, if it had an impact on the person who was, like, the respondent. I mean, like, I'm a woman and the canvasser was a woman, maybe this has more influence on me than if it was a male. I can't really connect with a male experience. I don't know if you have any information on that.
Well, Michael is currently writing a paper on heterogeneous treatment effects, looking at canvasser characteristics, subject characteristics, and contextual factors. And so that's what we're going to try to do. Well, he's going to do. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it, but he's going to work on this in the next few weeks and months, which is a kind of a nice supplement to this paper. But I honestly don't know the answer to the question of which canvassers were more effective. It is a delicate business. We thought about doing this gender of canvasser thing. Just remember, it's a delicate business to classify the gender of some of our gay canvassers, because they are transgender people or ambiguous people. So this is where it's not so obvious how you do this particular comparison between gay and straight. And in fact, you'll see there's a table, eventually when the paper's out, you'll see there's a table that reports the canvasser's own self-reported characteristics. And they're very, very similar in terms of gay and straight. So they're similar. Where they really differ is where people say, when they're asked, do other people tend to perceive you as gay or straight? And I think it's about 2/3 of the gay canvassers say they're usually perceived as gay. Only, I think, 11% of the straight canvassers say that people perceive them as gay.
The issue about having a canvasser being trans or gender ambiguous, I think it's something that it would be really interesting to explore, because I can imagine, like, some of the people I know would be responsive to meeting a very heteronormative gay male or lesbian, but would be more defensive if they were having a discussion with a trans person having the same discourse.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree. I think I'm super interested in this. Could not be more interested in this. I think, and frankly, I think it would be very interesting if just even a slight modification of the script. What if the gay canvasser uses the same script as the straight canvasser? Instead of talking about their own sexuality, they talk about a friend's. Because then you've really held exactly constant the script. And then in a way, if you had that as a comparison group, it would almost be the pure effect of contact. Because now people are revealing themselves. But it's a super interesting topic. Sweet.
I'm interested in what you're doing here in contact hypothesis. And one of the differences for me is that the contact hypothesis is about coming into contact with diverse others, but not talking about the ways in which they are diversely other when you're with them. You're doing something else.
That's a really good point.
And that makes
That's a really good point.
So that makes me kind of interested in the impact of the following weird script, which I thought was weird until I heard your conversation with your mother. That's clearly weird.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the following script. Hi, I'm gay, and I'm here to talk to you about recycling. I kind of want to know what happens if they talk about something different, but
Yeah.
reveal their sexuality in the process.
Yeah, that would be damn interesting. Well, maybe if they don't literally lead off with that, but it just comes up.
It just comes up.
For example, you could say, recycling is really important. My husband and I, we
Yeah.
recycle all the time. We're really committed to it.
And you wear a rainbow pin, or you're from an association that is obviously a gay association.
Right. That I agree. That would be interesting. And you're right. That's an important subtlety of the contact hypothesis. Usually, it's not, oh, we're in the army together. You are a black person. I'm a white person. We're all getting it together. It's not that at all. It's just that we just happen to be, pursuing the same superordinate goals, the same values.
But I don't understand. Like, you have a gay canvasser who talks about recycling.
Yes, but they don't reveal themselves.
They don't reveal it, but still, they say they are perceived to be gay in so many
Right.
cases. I mean, that's got self-perception, but still, there is something there. But it doesn't have an effect. I mean, here we already know a little bit, at least, about that scenario. I guess we could make it more explicit.
Well, actually, I missed them. They think what's their point estimate of how frequently they're perceived as gay?
About 2/3.
So it would then be, it would be interesting then to break up that group that just talks about recycling. So there isn't a recycling by gay and recycling.
There is.
There is clean.
It is
very
interesting.
interesting.
It is. Well, that part is interesting. I'd like to. I think this contact hypothesis is just a really fascinating thing. It's very, very much the case that in political science, usually when we talk about contact, we're talking about the other side of it. We're saying, oh, it's the racial threat hypothesis that we're talking about. Not so much. We all get it.
I first have a clarification question. The canvassers were all from one organization?
Yes.
And they were an organization for gay rights?
Yes. But they included both straight people and gay people.
Yes, I understand. So the problem with that then is that they cannot be as enthusiastic about the environmental
Absolutely.
recycling issue, right? So I mean, in that sense, for you to claim at the end that an environmental talk doesn't have the same effect is maybe cannot be claimed as much because they might not have talked as enthusiastically about recycling as they have talked about.
You're totally right. What I have in mind when I say that is when you think about paid canvassers, right, who are just punching the clock, they're just paid to do their thing. Go, Leland, I want you to knock on 100 doors today, come back, with yeses or nos, right? And I mean, it's very routinized work. And I think that that's sort of like this kind of canvassing.
Mm-hmm.
Recycling also requires that you change your own behavior. It's closer to smoking than it is to gay rights. Gay rights, you just have to let other people do it.
Yes.
Recycling requires that
In this particular case, though, in this recycling case, they don't have to change their behavior. They're just talking about their support for a ballot measure. But you're right. You're right. There are, by the way, canvassing experiments on recycling.
Yes.
But I have a second issue. The other issue was whether you can actually look at whether the effect is larger for people who never had a gay contact before this one at the door. Because I would assume that this is actually where the contact hypothesis should be strongest, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. We had a conversation at lunch a little bit about this, about the role of treatment by covariate interactions. Okay, so we haven't gotten to the bottom of this, and Michael's writing the separate paper on heterogeneous effects. But I want to point out that we do ask in the baseline wave, how much contact have you had, or do you have gay friends and family? If so, how much? And what's interesting about that is if you say the effect is a bit stronger for people who have no gay friends or family, or claim to, but what's interesting about that is we can't tell whether whether the effect really would be different if those people, the same people, had newfound friends and family, or whether that's a marker for other things that make them either more receptive to the script or less attentive or whatever. They're not, it could be a lot of things. I should point out also that Michael, one of his projects is to work on spillovers of others in the social network, because remember, this is a snowball sample. So people didn't necessarily have to live with you. And he's working currently on whether there are spillovers to other people you communicate with, presumably online. Oh, and another thing I want to point out is that although you might be worried that the spillover effect is just due to the fact that people are filling out each other's surveys, but they're extremely careful to invite them to do these surveys at different times of the day for people in the same household, and they do complete them at different times of the day in different places, work versus home, and so their IP login is registered. It's careful.
Thank you. I was thinking about the role of religion since the United States is quite a religious country, and these questions are connected to religion in some sense, and also abortion, as you mentioned. And I was wondering is that an argument for you actually underestimating the effects, so that it's even more difficult to change attitudes that are connected to religion than other attitudes? So that if you, for example, would go to the European context and you would do the same issue on immigration, or the views of Roman immigrant citizens, or the views of Jews in some specific suburbs of European countries, that you would get even larger effects by the contact.
It's interesting. It's interesting to ask whether, religion is kind of a non-negotiable point of discussion in politics, or whether it's just one of the many things that makes you more conservative on this issue. It would be fascinating to know. And again, it's a little bit tricky to figure out. It's a little like this question about prior contact with gays. Isn't it religious people are more resistant because they're religious, or is being religious a marker for other things that make you more resistant to change?
But I say in this case, you can use religious arguments pretty easy to argue against same-sex marriage, because you can find the argument in the
I see what
Bible,
you're saying.
and also for the abortion, right? That you should respect life. So therefore, the arguments can be found in religion. It's not only the way that you are as a person.
It's a really good point. That it would be, again, it's a reason why this kind of study needs to be done again on other issues, and in other contexts, because it would be fascinating to know under what conditions do people move. If we got away from some of these non-negotiable, religious, tenets to things that were more a matter of sort of policy give and take, would we see more change?
One such issue could be in the European context could be the view of Romans, or so-called gypsies,
Yes.
you're not allowed to call them. That you talk about a lot as well, because one of the things is say that maybe these questions are things that we don't talk so much about because it's personal. The view of sexuality, of abortion, but a view of immigration and xenophobia are things that people talk about, especially in the European context. It's an election issue, we discuss it a lot. And it's also, some people are even proud of having these. So that could be one way of
Pretty fascinating.
Okay, I have a couple, mostly comments and more a question. Following up on that, we're really going to get into religion in this topic. Try sending out religious canvassers. Try running some Christian left scripts. Religious arguments going in the opposite direction. But that's not really my main concern.
It could be done.
So the canvassing was done in areas that supported Prop 8.
Yes,
in
in precincts. Yeah.
Okay. I was just trying to interpret the baseline, support for marriage equality and the thermometer scores.
Yeah.
And they're both fairly neutral.
Yeah, they're lower than California as a whole.
Yeah. Let's see. So the thing that I found most interesting from your tables was there seems to be, so if you look at the direct effect, there seems to be no real decay among the gay canvassers in the marriage equality script, and decay among the straight canvassers.
Yes.
But then if you look at the spillover effects, there's a bit of a decay among the gay canvassers, who are the only ones to really register an effect.
Yes.
This is harder to see in study 2 because you have fewer like Waves survey.
Yeah.
I think that says something about the importance of like the direct interaction for the stability.
Yeah.
That's something you.
I think that's right. I think that this sort of secondhand contact is probably less memorable. You know, in some ways, your housemate has now told you, "I had this interesting conversation with this gay person, and they seemed, you know, pretty persuasive." And you know, maybe that gets you to think, well, maybe I should rethink my view on this issue too. But it doesn't. I mean, the secondhand effect is much smaller and more delicate.
But then, like the strategic implication would be that if you're trying to persuade people, you would want to directly canvass people.
Yes. On the other hand, you could say, given that you have limited resources and you're knocking on people's doors, you should feel good about the bonus you're going to get as these effects diffuse to others in the household. Because if a person has 2 or 3 housemates, and those effects on average are what they are, you know, you get basically the equivalent of 1 extra direct contact. Andre, again?
But with the court decision, I'm playing the court decision. Extremely interesting. Would you be able to tell whether it's the people who moved from 3 to 4 and then 4 to 5, or is it people who didn't move an issue at all? That's what, took the court decisions to move them to 3 to 5.
Yeah, I think we report that in the paper. I'm pretty sure that we say, okay, so where did you start and where did you end up at wave 6? In the wake of the court decision, after the dust is settled from the court decision, and what you again see is this, you know, basically a shift across the board. Obviously, the people who are strongly favorable have no place to move, but the people who are at the strongly opposed have pretty much cleared out. They're, you know, the weakly favorable becomes strongly favorable. Everybody's shifted over about a scale point, and in particular, there are very few people who remain strongly opposed. Strongly opposed. They moved to somewhat opposed. They're still opposed, but they're somewhat opposed. And it's really kind of remarkable. I think there were only like 2 people left in the gay canvasser condition. 2 people who started off, like say 30 or 40, who started off strongly opposed, who end up strongly opposed at the end. Again, they're not clamoring to support this thing, but they've now softened. Sorry, yes.
I would just like to bounce back on some comments that were made previously, notably about religion, and I would just like to enlarge to the fact that moral issues like abortion or gay marriage, for political scientists, we tend to interpret these issues as huge political issues. For average respondents, they might very well interpret these issues as personal and private issues. So I would like to hear your thoughts on this distinction between what we could consider as more private issues for the average citizen and what could be interpreted as more, say, political issues like recycling or, say, foreign policy or immigration policies. If the effect that we see in representation is attributable to the fact that these being more personal issues, your subjects are more easily moved by the conversation and the interaction they have with the canvassers. And this would not be possible if the issue was more, say, abstract or more clearly political.
I think it's damn interesting. I mean, again, it's a kind of wide open question. What would move people? Very often the argument is the reason public opinion, at least in the United States, looks the way it looks is because people tend to, you know, personalize a lot of their decisions. So they think about the presidential candidates as people, not as abstract bundles of policy views, and they think about these issues in very, you know, down-to-earth terms. So this may be a distinction without a difference. I don't know. On the other hand, it may be that, you know, you can move people a lot more easily in the context of pure politics because it's considered kind of wonkish and not that interesting to people, except people who are very much engaged. I mean, I think what's kind of interesting about this issue is that someone can walk to your door and become a kind of personal embodiment for the issue. Like this is on the ballot in California. It has a direct relationship to my life, and I just want to talk to you about it, neighbor to neighbor. Now, I guess you could do that for other kinds of ballot measures. It'd be damn interesting, actually, to do that. To say, here are a bunch of ballot measures on the California ballot. Let's see what kind of conversations you can have with people to move them around. Please.
So until one of your responses to an earlier question, I actually thought, maybe because you're Don Green and I assume you just randomize everything all the time, I thought you randomized the claims of sexual orientation. And so I wonder if it's not a concern that, well, so as a straight guy, I might be very passionate about gay rights, but I just won't be as enthusiastic because to me it's kind of an intellectual belief rather than something that I have personally at stake.
Right.
And these people are just, they speak louder and they're more in the contact. They're just more convincing. And is that not? And so I was going to suggest, well, randomizing that, but given the self-perception figure, maybe that's hard to do in this context.
Yes.
But it would be easy to do in a study about abortion, where you mentioned, some people mentioned that they have a friend who went through this and others don't, or there you can randomize it. But to me, especially looking at the indirect effects, I just have to think that maybe there's something there that something personal.
Right. That it isn't contact per se, it's the fervor with which they communicate these ideas. On the other hand, I guess, maybe this is again why it would be useful to actually interview the canvassers. Because I think once you're talking about a straight canvasser that signs up to canvass or vote for equality, they're pretty darn committed to this. But I don't know. I just don't know what they actually sound like at the door. And that's why it would be interesting to you can almost imagine we should have done this exercise. You have the canvassers practicing their script and you just watch them.
No, on this point, you could just use only straight canvassers and assign them, to the status of being gay and being straight. And that would.
Well, that's what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid lying to people. But what you could do is have a gay person not mention that they're gay.
They could still be perceived.
Right. That would be, but they could randomly mention it or not mention it, and then have whether this mention has an effect. Yep.
So then the actual question I wanted to ask is about this last bullet point. Right, so you start off the talk with observational data that there's this sudden change. It's a crazy puzzle, and the thing is, and then you do this cool experiment that essentially kind of takes a jab at one possible mechanism underlying the observational data change. And then in the last bullet point, you come back and you say, maybe this is it. And so I wonder, because this is in many ways, I imagine this is how your work goes. You observe cool things happening in the world, you do experiments in a given setting, and then you hope that this informs what's happening in the greater world. So how do you make that connection, right? In this case, it just cannot be all contact by definition, because, well, contact maybe explains why once the snowball is rolling, it picks up steam, because then you have more contact than that. But it can't be the thing that pushes the snowball in the first place. So it can't be the whole story. And I wonder if you can say something about that choice of the jab in the first place, of the mechanism to experiment on, and how then it might inform the greater picture.
It's a good point. I mean, it's like this age-old debate between people who study causes of effects and effects of causes, right? They're just, whether you start with the phenomenon, that big trend, and you say, I want to study each of the ingredients that might contribute to this overall trend, or whether you say, I'm really interested in this kind of micro-level effect, and I note that it has this implication, that it could contribute to this overall trend. I'm sort of in the latter group. And at the end of the day, it's going to be really, really difficult to disentangle something as complicated as this secular trend, and in attitudes, especially when it's confounded by all the other things happening in the environment, especially the media environment. Because it's often argued that people who met gay people in Modern Family may have become more supportive of gay equality. In fact, I think actually it wouldn't be a bad thing to take a whole bunch of people who have never seen those shows and do a simple randomized experiment where you have them watch. I mean, geez, you guys, that's a publishable thing. I mean, you don't have to break a sweat to do that study. You can do that anyway. But you're basically taking people who are already untreated, and asking, do you get the Joe Biden effect? Because much is ascribed to that. But just as a reminder that, these kinds of massive secular trends are very, very complicated. And I really don't, this is nothing more than a kind of speculation. But I think it gets us thinking. You're entitled.
I have a small wonder about the spillover effect. I was wondering if you had any information about the composition of the households. So did you only canvass family units, or did you also canvass roommates? And I imagine that perhaps a father sitting down at a dinner table and telling his family about his contact with a gay person might have a different effect than me telling my roommate, in the morning as we get ready to go to work, oh, I met this canvasser.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's anything.
These were almost all families,
Okay.
because these were single-family homes in, kind of middle class, not upper middle class, but kind of middle and lower middle class suburbs.
And that was intentional on your part, or? Yeah.
Right, because we wanted to first of all, they were largely opposed to gay equality, same-sex marriage. But secondly, we wanted it to be canvassable turf. We wanted to be able to talk to these people. And if you have locked security departments. So for that reason, it tends not to be, people in a college town or something like that.
Do you think there might be a different spillover effect?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I know that this is what McGill's working on now. He's working on the household context, and he has a finding. I have to look at it. It has to do with how much heterogeneity there is in the household to begin with, and how that affects how much movement you get. So I think this is down the pipe.
Just a question, because if you look on panel B on the table 5, you showed us a little bit before that after the Supreme Court's judgment, there was another effect among those people who had been exposed to the main treatment. The effect jumping from 0.82. Are you there?
Yep.
Do you have a theoretical explanation? What is the cause of that?
Well, this is the overall jump. The overall jump that you see in all the groups is presumably due to the fact that there's a huge amount of positive media coverage of this event. So this is not. Michael actually analyzed the news coverage of this event, and it is overwhelmingly positive. This is a breakthrough moment. Supreme Court is denounced these laws against same-sex marriage. Gay people are celebrating. Lots of people are saying good things about the court's decision, despite the fact that it's a conservative court. Blah blah blah. So I think that this is sort of the honeymoon period right after that, where everybody says, "Oh, now there's a kind of elite norm that we can now kind of take under advisement." But then it subsides. It's not that big to begin with in the control group. It's barely noticeable if you didn't have a panel survey, but it's big enough. But the question is what's going on in the treatment group, and I don't think there's going to be an answer, but one answer is, boy, I just changed my mind a bit on this question, and now it looks like the Supreme Court is changing its mind too. Maybe we're all taking a fresh look at this thing. And that might be simple. Yeah.
I really like this study. Sorry. I like this study. I'm just not convinced by one thing. One, I think, major issue is the fact that opinion has changed so much over time. And the problem is that it could be that these kind of events, like a Supreme Court decision, over time have accumulated, and if many people sort of change their views but still have trouble expressing them. So maybe it's not persuasion. Maybe it's more that you're helping people express their views. So I'm wondering if maybe what would really convince me actually might be if you had a similar study, but on an issue where opinion doesn't change that much over time, the proportion. And I think that would be really interesting, because here the fact that it's changed over time, you really can't see what is driving the change. There might be all these factors that are sort of hidden, and you might just be helping people express their views by discussing these groups in a positive way. So it might not be persuasion, just more, I guess, activation or facilitation. I'm not sure what the correct term is, but just helping people express those views.
Yeah, I guess I'd be more convinced of your point if we didn't see uniform relative shifts. If we saw the somewhat favorables becoming favorable and nobody else moving, then you say, oh, we were just helping them along. They were supportive, they met a gay person, they moved. But what seems to be the case here is you're taking people who are, their precincts voted for Prop 8. They're strongly opposed to same-sex marriage, and now they're somewhat opposed.
But maybe just over time as support for same-sex marriage has gone up, you become somewhat less opposed.
Yeah, but that's true for the control group too. I mean, everybody should be. Everybody should be
express
drifting.
those views. So it's difficult for them to express views against same-sex marriage, but by having these canvases who are so positive about it and have a really personal approach, it might make it easier for them to express them.
Okay, but I don't think that's different from persuasion. I mean, in a way, everybody has some latent level of ambivalence on every issue, and if I could just change repeatedly the way in which you express yourself, that's pretty similar to an attitude change.
Well, I mean, it happens with, it's not just the fact of what you guys are doing, it's also what's changing in the context. So it would be interesting just to compare this to another issue where there isn't a change overall.
Oh, I totally agree. The way forward for this paradigm is to do this with other issues.
Yeah.
For sure. Dylan, thank you very much for having me.
I think we've exhausted our right to bother you any further. 3 talks and an extended Q&A, and there's not much more.
Way over time.
And
Sorry.
soon you have to leave before the end. That's really the last moment. Well, thank you very much
Thank you so much.
for this wonderful. And our gratitude, we have a little gift for you to take away, and we would like you to open it now.
Wow. All right, let's see. It has the
Even more demands,
shiny McGill paper. I don't want this to be like a human rights violation. I can't get your Zoom. All right. Oh my goodness. Jeez. Wow. Wow. It's like a T-shirt about my talk.
Did we overestimate your size or no?
I
think so. Anyway, I hope you fit, and I hope you will like it.
Appreciate it. Great, I love it.